Hi there, Frogg Moody here from the Salisbury History Festival. Just a few words to say thank you for all the lovely comments I received for part one of Fisherton House Asylum. This is part two, and looking at the lovely painting here of Fisherton House. I don't actually know where this came from, but what a magnificent painting it is. Now, what I'm going to do on part two is talk a little bit about the owners to start with of Fisherton House. So in 1779, William Finch purchased Laverstock House. It was already a madhouse, but William Finch was not a qualified doctor. However, Laverstock House was taken over by his son, William Corbin Finch, who was a doctor, a qualified doctor, and he also acquired Fisherton House in 1813. He also kept two other licensed madhouses in fashionable London, Kensington House and the Retreat in the King's Road. It's recorded that the first patients were received at Fisherton House on January the 25th, 1813. Now I have to admit that this is actually earlier than what I said in part one, so I've got the opportunity to put the record straight now. By 1828 there were 76 patients in residence. In 1841 Fisherton House was licensed for 70 pauper patients and 30 private patients. In 1920, Fisherton House changed its name to the Old Manor Hospital. Laverstock House continued until 1955 and was eventually demolished. Now, I've been recently told that somewhere near the Duck public house at Laverstock is the last remaining relic of the old Laverstock madhouse. It's just a piece of wall. Here is Laverstock House in all its former glory. Fisherton House Asylum was owned and run first by the Finch family and later by the Chubb family. The two families were related by marriage. Around 1923, a limited company was set up to run the hospital with the Chubb family as shareholders. The asylum was taken over by the NHS in 1954. But prior to this, it was England's largest private mental hospital with just over 700 beds. And here is a picture of the beautiful Finch House. At one time, Finch House had a watchtower, a story higher, and this was taken down because it became too unsafe. The front garden to Finch House originally had a large round rockery as a centrepiece of the lawn. In the Second World War, the rockery was replaced by a static water tank, and it was here that the wonderful fountain eventually found its home after being wheeled down from Bemerton Lodge, which was just a short distance away at Wilton Road. The main building, which is still referred to as Finch House, had large cellars and storerooms, and I remember exploring these in the 1990s and again on a special visit in 2015. Now here we are on our special visit in 2015. This visit was given to Fisherton History Society by Quantum Developers. Salisbury photographer Spencer Mulholland captured some excellent images and has kindly allowed us to see them, and there will be more of these later. The left-hand photo shows me descending the steps into the large cellar on the right. So let us have a closer look at Dr. William Corbin Finch, because some of the buildings that we associate with the old manor were constructed when he was the owner. As we have seen, he took over Langarrow House from his father and was medical superintendent of both Laverstock House and Fisherton House. As if that wasn't enough, he was a city alderman from 1842 to 1856 and Mayor of Salisbury in 1842. He was the man who proposed the building of St. Paul's Church in Fisherton, and he was a senior physician at Salisbury Infirmary, so quite an eventful life until his death in 1867 in Salisbury. In the early 1800s, Dr. Finch felt obliged to put an advert in the Salisbury Journal denying the rumour of his impending removal from Laverstock House and charting the extensive additions he was making for the comfort of patients. He also added that he was prepared to attend patients in their own homes at any reasonable distance from Salisbury, an early form of care in the community, you might say. In 1820, an insane gentleman who for a short time had been under the care of Dr. Finch at Laverstock House was asked by his friends to be released. This was on the advice of a servant who had recently been discharged from the asylum. Dr. Finch protested in the strongest terms, but was unable to stop the man from being discharged with terrible consequences. For as soon as the man found himself under the uncontrolled influence of his passions, he purchased a gun and shot himself. Another advert appeared in the Salisbury Journal in June 1836. The advert said this: "At Fisherton House there are extensive pleasure grounds and gardens, which have been recently much enlarged, and at great expense improved. These form a distinguishing portion of the establishment, and are so studiously laid out as to produce a pleasing variety of amusements, and to gratify the patient's natural desire for change. The attendants are carefully selected, and of approved humanity and kind disposition. However, during the Victorian era, there are numerous accounts in the local press of attendants ill-treating the patients. This case was brought before Salisbury Petty Sessions in 1861. Two attendants at Fisherton House, Samuel George and Joseph Grace, were charged with ill-treating a criminal lunatic called Francis Owen. Dr. Finch was called to give evidence and record that, after hearing about the incident, he examined Owen and found that he had been considerably bruised. He had a conversation with the defendant, Samuel George, and accused him of ill-treating Owen, which he denied, saying it must have been the other attendant, Joseph Grace. Dr. Finch dismissed both men and reported the incident to the Lunacy Commission. George and Grace were the only two attendants on the ward that night, and two patients named Soames and Green witnessed the assault. Both gave evidence that the attendants had beaten Owen for 3 nights running because he was troublesome and wouldn't stay in bed at night. On one occasion, they had actually tied him to the bed. Dr. Finch then gave some interesting information. "I produce a printed form which is put into the hands of the keepers, in which they are instructed not to use force. I also produce the rules of the asylum, in which it is stated that the keepers are not, under any circumstances, to strike a patient or to use any unnecessary force except in self-defense. The attendants are aware that they are liable of fine or imprisonment if they commit any act of violence." So this is not Fisherton House, but it gives an impression of one of the wards where Francis Owen was beaten. It goes without saying that many of the convict patients could be extremely dangerous, and in 1853 considerable alarm was felt by the inhabitants of Fisherton when 5 convict lunatics escaped from Fisherton House. After overpowering one of the attendants, they took his bunch of keys and locked all the doors where the other attendants were sleeping, making sure they left the stolen keys in the locks. They made their escape, taking as much clothes as they could carry. So this picture now depicts the 2 attendants. They've summoned a policeman and they're pointing the way where the lunatics have run off to. It was some time before the alarm was raised and the escape made known to the asylum officials. The police were informed and they searched in every direction. One of the men was captured in a field of barley and the other about 9 miles from the asylum. It's not actually recorded what happened to the other 3 men. In 1859, we see the caring nature of Dr. Finch via this first-hand account. When a convict, Mary Newell, was admitted to Fisherton House, Finch recorded, "She was admitted under my care by order of Secretary of State on the 5th of April 1859 in a fearful state. She was brought here by 3 officials of Reading Gaol, well secured in a strait waistcoat. This mechanical restraint was at once removed, and she was put to bed. For some time she continued in a very violent state, and only the faintest hope could be entertained of her surviving the shock. Improvement, however, commenced about the 6th day after her admission. She became more tranquil, natural sleep succeeded, and daily improvement was established. I can now state that she is out of danger. If she is sent back to the prison, she will probably become an imbecile or maniac for the remainder of her days. Now I'm asking if nothing can be done to save her from this fate. Now, one of the most important things that William Corbin Finch Sr. undertook was the building of a new chapel within the walls of Fisherton House. At the time of construction, the area of the institution had grown to 12 acres, with gardens of immense quality, a most fitting environment for the chapel to stand in. The chapel was built to house 150 persons, and at the time there were 80 private patients, 170 government patients, and 100 ordinary patients. As we look at the photograph, notice the wonderful stained glass window and how beautiful the chapel looks. So what does it look like today? Dreadful. And this photograph was taken a few years ago. I have recently made inquiries about the chapel, but I have not received a reply as yet. Almost within touching distance of the chapel was the ballroom, which is still talked about today. Together with its magnificent mirrors, it certainly hosted some memorable events over the years. It has been published that the ballroom was constructed in 1868-69, but I believe it was actually built earlier in the 1850s. This would mean that it was sanctioned by Dr. William Corbin Finch Sr. and not his son, who we will talk about later. That's Dr. William Corbin Finch Jr. 5 years before his death in 1867, William Corbin Finch Sr. was again in the Salisbury Journal, where Fisherton House was reported as for the cure and care of insane patients of both sexes. He stated that the house had been refitted and rearranged throughout, and the guide and treatment of patients was kindness, varied recreation, constant medical supervision, and a total absence of personal restraint. To back this up, an extract from the report of the Metropolitan Commission of Lunacy stated, "We think that the mode of treatment at Fisherton House has been attended with satisfactory results and worthy of special note." After William Corbin Finch Sr. had died in 1867, his son, pictured here, William Corbin Finch Jr., took over Fisherton House. This was in partnership with his brother-in-law, Dr. John Alfred Lush. Dr. Lush was well respected in Salisbury, where he had already set up practice and worked tirelessly during the cholera epidemics of 1849 and 1854. In 1866, Dr. Lush became Mayor of Salisbury and took an active part in public life. Too much, in fact, because the strain resulted in him giving up his public duties due to ill health. He moved to London in 1880 and passed away in 1888. One of the highlights of the partnership of Dr. Lush and Dr. Corbin Finch was in the autumn of 1870, when the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, visited Fisherton House during the army manoeuvres on Salisbury Plain. He stayed at Bemerton Lodge at the invitation of Dr. Lush and William Corbin Finch Jr. Later, the Prince and his staff attended a concert in Fisherton House Ballroom. It was then called the Royal Ballroom, and a royal coat of arms for many years took pride of place above the stage. But like so many things at the old manor, it went missing. So this map shows the extent of the establishment in 1881, and as the years went on, the Finch family expanded further. But let's stick with the 1880s, because this is the approximate date that the much talked about tunnel was built. The tunnel I'm referring to ran almost the entire length of the property, and it was built for the segregation of the male and female patients. The door into the tunnel was near the fountain. This picture is a new picture I've recently acquired from the arts group at Salisbury District Hospital, so thank you to them for supplying this picture. Now, other supposed tunnels are forever being mentioned on social media, including one that was said to lead from the Old Manor to the railway station. Another was said to go under Wilton Road from Orchard House to the Old Manor mortuary. I have never found any evidence for the last two mentioned tunnels. But regarding the mortuary, which was situated near the old laundry, two stained glass windows were made by a patient, and when the Old Manor closed, I rescued one of the windows from the skip. It's in a bit of a state, but there's no way it should have been thrown away. It's now housed in my courtyard. One thing the patients had plenty of was food. Much of it was grown in-house. Here is a weekly diet sheet from the 1880s. We're going to fill the gaps in, and I'm going to read to you exactly what they would have had for breakfast, dinner and supper. So breakfast, 7 ounces of bread, half an ounce of butter, quarter of an ounce of tea, half an ounce of sugar, 2 ounces of milk. Dinner, 5 ounces of cooked meat 4 times a week, 3 ounces of stew twice a week, 20 ounces of meat and potato pie once a week, 16 ounces of vegetables 4 times a week, 12 ounces of pudding once a week, 4 ounces of bread every day, a quarter of a pint of beer every day. Supper, 6 ounces of bread daily, half an ounce of butter daily, 1 pint of tea daily. If a patient worked in the gardens, their diet was enhanced, no doubt to include more beer, which, as we all know, is a staple diet of all gardeners. In 1903, there was a terrible case of mistaken identity at Fisherton House. A number of female patients, around about 20 actually, from London County Council were buried with the wrong names and mourned by the wrong relatives. The Lunacy Commission put this very serious mistake down to the lax method of receiving patients at Fisherton House and concluded the grave consequences, especially if the patients whose identity had been confused were married. Dr. William Corbin Finch Jr. died at his home in Bemerton Lodge, aged 72, in 1905. He had been confined to bed for some weeks and succumbed to an attack of pneumonia. At the time of his death, Fisherton House was said to be the largest institute of its kind in England. Formerly, he had been associated in the institute with Dr. Lush, but for 20 years he had been the sole proprietor. Unlike his father, he took no part in local public affairs and was essentially a private person, but he was very generous, especially to the poor, who he often helped out in times of trouble. He owned much property in Salisbury and was one of the wealthiest men in Wiltshire. His coffin was carried from his home in Bemerton Lodge by attendants of Fisherton House, and the funeral at Devizes Road Cemetery was attended by nurses and employees of Fisherton House, along with many other Salisbury citizens. The funeral arrangements were carried out by Messrs. Style and Garish. It's recorded that in 1918 the proprietor of Fisherton House was Sir Cecil Chubb. It was during his time that in 1924 Dr. Elizabeth Kimberly Walker née Clark became the first female doctor at Fisherton House. I'm grateful to my friend Alan Crooks, who gave me the following details. During the house clearance of her late son, Mr. Rodney Walker, in 2016, a number of artefacts belonging to his late mother and relating to her role at the Old Manor Hospital were uncovered. These included her doctor's bag and assorted contents, including homemade medical microscope slides, a door plaque giving her consultation times, emergency splint kit, a human skeleton not assembled, and her medical study notes in hard-covered notebook embossed with her name in gold leaf from Edinburgh University. Elizabeth Kimberly Clark was born in Lockerbie on the 30th of March 1900 and received her medical training at the University of Edinburgh. On completion of her training, she worked briefly in London before moving to Salisbury to work at the Old Manor Hospital as the first female medical officer. At the time, this role was still considered to be a training role, so she worked without a wage. On completion of this role, she was accepted for a job in London, but was offered and took a paid position at the Old Manor Hospital. After marrying in London on the 12th of April 1927 to Cecil Walker, she moved to Parkstone in Poole, where she continued to work as a general practitioner. Before and during World War II, she was a Surgeon General for the Red Cross. Okay, next we have a picture of Kennet Lodge, and I'd like to stay on the theme of personal memories because Roger Harrison gave me this fascinating account of his time at the Old Manor Hospital. For some years, my appointment at the Old Manor Hospital was that of Senior Charge Nurse of Kennet Lodge, now known as the Quaker Meeting House. Originally, this building was, according to an old colleague of mine, a coaching house used by travellers to and from the city of New Sarum, latterly known as Salisbury. In 1773, a brick kiln was documented as producing bricks, known as Fisherton Greys, prior to the Old Manor being built. The colour of these bricks can be seen on such buildings as the Paragon and Grove House across the road from the Quaker Meeting House. It was on this brick kiln site that Fisherton House was eventually built before being purchased and used as an asylum. Pembroke House was built in 1820, 5 years after Fisherton House had been bought by William Finch for the confinement of lunatics. How these two stories relate to each other, I am not sure, but Pembroke House was known as a villa, a private ward for female patients, a nurse's home, then Kennet Lodge, a halfway house for the rehabilitation of long-term patients before being purchased by the Quakers. The architecture of this building is quite fascinating, and there were several floors of varying levels in the house, some being corridors connecting two buildings together. One of the buildings, which I think no longer exists, was of 2 stories. Upstairs was the outline of a large doorway in the external brickwork, which could well have been the entrance to a hayloft, giving some credit to the coaching house theory. There was a small sunken garden between these 2 buildings, and one wall of this garden resembled a piece of 13th century church window. Now there are some ghostly happenings I'd like to report. During the time that I managed Kennet Lodge, I heard many stories about the past. One of my staff, who had commenced employment before I was born, told me that she would not go down the far end of the cellar in the lodge because she'd heard a baby crying in a large pantry cupboard. This ghostly story, she said, was a result of some dastardly deed committed many years before. For other interested ghost hunters, I heard doors open and close on an unoccupied floor whilst on a sleep-in duty one night, and on Ashford Ward the rather elegant portrait of a lady in grey was never allowed to be removed for fear of ghostly reprisals thereafter. During decorations it was never left the room. Roger continued, "The original Bemerton Lodge was a beautifully built house. This building had an enormous orangery in which cream teas were served on special occasions such as inter-hospital sports days, hospital fetes and cricket matches. I was told that the Bemerton Lodge fountain was moved on 2-wheeled trucks down Wilton Road to the main hospital site by 2 gardeners. After Bemerton Lodge was deemed redundant, demolition contractors tendered for the contract because of the types of materials used in its construction. This was quite competitive. Since this dim and distant past, many changes have been made, and only the buildings which have been listed are likely to remain." Roger Harrison mentioned the old Ashford ward, and it was during the building's part demolition in 2001 that a wall linking the old Ashford and Hyney wards was found to have names and carvings etched on the surface. Tony Howell worked at the Old Manor Hospital for 35 years and helped compile a historical book on the hospital. He remembers the discovery of the slab. "I was walking past the workmen and heard this commotion, so I thought I would go and see what it was all about. When I got there, I saw it was this big slab of concrete with some strange carvings, and I can only assume they were around a century old. The names and the carvings on the slab dated back to when the hospital was an asylum and contained the names of former patients including Gregory, Slater and Wood, with the former two dated at 1899 and the latter July 1912. An eerie face stenciled into the concrete adds to the intrigue of the discovery. Tony added, "There are still other carvings and mementos of its history throughout the building, but this piece was unique. Many patients carved their names, initials and drawings into the walls of the asylum, but with the building's development and renovation across 200 years, many of these were lost forever." So here is the picture of Finch House, and following the introduction of care in the community in the 1980s and also the transfer of services to Fountain Way, the Old Manor Hospital closed in 2003. In 2014, the site was acquired by the Quantum Group for 4.1 million. The development as a residential estate is ongoing, and we can only hope that Finch House, that once proud building now holding on to life via a bright red metal structure, will not suffer the same fate as many other historic buildings. I mentioned at the start of this presentation that a group of us had a special tour of the Old Manor back in 2015. I would like to finish by showing some of the photographs taken by my friend Spencer Malholland. So this shows the boarded up Avon House. I was often around here when I was part of the garden department. It was always specified, actually it says in Tony Howell's book that I mentioned, that the tower here was haunted. The nurses heard all sorts of sounds throughout the years. Two more pictures taken by Spencer. The one on the right, this shows the glass tunnel that can be seen from the Wilton Road. If you look across towards the fountain, well, the fountain that was there that's now disappeared, you will see this glass construction, and this led down to the Salisbury, to the Old Manor Hospital tunnel that I mentioned before, that went the whole length of the hospital. The image on the left, this is not the tunnel actually. This just shows one of the alleyways, underground alleyways, that goes under Finch House that leads to cellars. They're all linked up. Actually, some of the cellars are the size of an ordinary living room, but this one links two of the cellars together. This is one of my favourite photographs taken by Spencer in 2015. It shows a whole array of buildings. Let's go through them. So on the far right, you've got like a very modern building. This was the Old Manor Hospital staff canteen, where when I lived there, I had my breakfast, dinner, supper, and have very fond memories of the staff that worked there. There is a building, you can just see the end of it, like a brick building right in the middle of the picture. This was the Porter's Lodge, and above the Porter's Lodge was a private flat. The telephone box on the left-hand side, which I tried to buy off the Quantum Group, but they said it was already spoken for. I don't actually know if that's still there or not. If you look in the distance, you look just past or by to the right of the telephone box, way in the distance, you can see a building. That is Montague House, where I lived when I worked at the Old Manor as gardener. Now going back to the middle of the picture, you can see in the distance a big glass window building, and that is the Wilton Road Law Court. So we can see the Finch House on the right hand side. So this is the Old Manor Fountain, 2015. It was definitely still there, and it had this wooden construction housing it. It's now gone. The fountain's gone. I've been assured by the Quantum Group that it's gone away to be done up, and it will find its way back into their development at a later date. So thanks for listening to this presentation as part of the Salisbury History Festival. I'd like to finish by showing the picture of the fountain. We all hope that when it is restored, it returns to where it belongs on the Wilton Road. And just to thank all the people that have helped me get this presentation together. Thank you very much.